The morning sun had just begun to stretch its golden light across the quiet airfield in Virginia when Anna, a 12-year-old girl with curious brown eyes and a messy ponytail, stepped onto the small Cessna aircraft with her older brother Michael, who was 16 and trying hard to look calm even though his nervous hands gave him away, and as they found their seats in row 8, Anna pressed her forehead to the cool window glass and watched the world outside shrink into a blur of motion, families waving goodbye, the ground crew moving quickly, and the sight of their mother standing a little distance away, waving her handkerchief with a smile that carried warmth and comfort, reminding Anna of the promise she made to see them soon when they landed in North Carolina. And though Anna felt a shiver of nervousness deep inside her chest because this was her very first flight without her parents, she also felt a quiet thrill as the engine roared to life, the plane lifted from the runway, and the earth dropped away, leaving behind roads that looked like ribbons, houses like tiny toys, and rivers that twisted like silver lines beneath the wide open sky, and for a few minutes Anna forgot every worry, smiling at Michael and whispering, "It's like riding on a cloud," while Michael, always trying to sound older than his years, smirked and told her not to get sick, but even he kept sneaking glances out the window as if he too was amazed by the beauty of the world below. And the pilot, John Kennedy, an experienced man with gray streaks in his hair and calm steady hands, spoke through the intercom with a voice full of confidence and assurance, telling the small group of passengers that the flight would be smooth and easy, and his tone made everyone relax because it sounded like he had done this thousands of times, which in truth he had, since John was a retired Navy pilot who had flown through storms and emergencies far worse than anything this small Cessna could face on a quiet morning. Yet as the plane climbed higher, Anna's young heart beat fast, not from fear but from wonder, because she had never imagined she could see the tops of clouds so closely, white mountains floating in a sea of blue, and she whispered to Michael that she wanted to paint the view one day, though she wasn't much of a painter, and Michael chuckled softly, telling her she always dreamed too big, but deep down he admired her way of seeing the world, because where he often saw danger and risk, she saw possibility and beauty, and for a while everything was peaceful, so peaceful that Anna began to feel sleepy, the steady hum of the engine like a lullaby, and the passengers around her had settled into their own quiet, one man reading a newspaper, a woman humming softly, and an elderly couple holding hands as if they were on a Sunday drive in the sky. But then, without warning, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration in the seat beneath Anna, a tiny shiver running through the cabin, and she frowned, pressing her hand against the armrest as if to steady herself, whispering to Michael, "Did you feel that?" And Michael nodded, his jaw tightening, brushing it off with a shrug but his eyes darting nervously toward the front where the cockpit door stood slightly open, and in the next moment the humming of the engine, the steady comforting rhythm that had filled the cabin, stuttered, coughed, and grew uneven, like a song skipping on a broken record, and suddenly the air inside the plane seemed thinner, heavier, as though everyone realized at once that something was wrong, because the businessman lowered his newspaper, the woman stopped humming, the elderly couple gripped each other's hands tighter, and Anna's heart began to pound with a rhythm louder than the failing engine, and then the pilot's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it was different. Gone was the calm tone that had sounded like a lullaby of safety, replaced instead by a shaky edge that betrayed the seriousness of the moment, and his words, though simple, struck everyone like a cold wind. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may have a problem," and in that second silence fell over the cabin, a silence so deep that Anna could hear the quick breaths of the people behind her, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted nervously, the faint rattle of a coffee cup against its tray, and she turned to Michael, her voice almost breaking as she whispered, "Is the plane okay?" And Michael didn't answer, because for once he had no words, only fear reflected in his eyes, and Anna pressed her face back to the window, searching the endless sky as though answers might be written in the clouds, but all she saw was the vast blue stretching out forever and the ground far below, a patchwork of green and brown fields that suddenly seemed impossibly distant, and as she sat there, gripping the armrest with hands that felt too small to hold onto anything, a thought rose inside her, uninvited but impossible to push away. Maybe this flight was not going to be like the safe and simple adventure she had imagined. Maybe today was going to ask more of her than she ever believed she could give, and though she did not yet understand it, though she could not have put it into words, this was the moment that would begin to change her forever, the moment when a 12-year-old girl in row 8, just an ordinary child on an ordinary day, would find herself standing at the edge of something extraordinary. The sudden quiet inside the cabin was like a heavy blanket pressing down on everyone, because the steady roar of the engine, the one sound that had given them comfort since takeoff, was no longer there, and Anna felt her heart jump into her throat as she leaned closer to the window, her young eyes wide as she searched for signs of what was happening, but all she could see was the vast blue sky and the faraway ground that seemed much too far below to ever touch again, and beside her Michael's face had gone pale, his hand gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles looked white, yet he kept his jaw set as though he did not want his little sister to see his fear, but Anna could see it anyway because she had always known him better than anyone, and in that moment she realized he was just as scared as she was, and across the rows other passengers were beginning to stir uneasily, the businessman folding his newspaper slowly as though afraid of making noise, the elderly couple whispering prayers to each other, the woman who had been humming now holding her bag close to her chest, and through all of this the silence was broken only by the uneven sputtering sound coming from the front of the plane, a sound that told everyone something was very wrong. And then the intercom crackled again and the pilot's voice returned, but this time it was heavier, strained, as he said, "We've lost power. I am working on it, please remain calm," and although his words asked for calm, his voice carried an edge that even the youngest listener could hear, and Anna knew without understanding all the details that the man in charge of flying this plane was struggling, and when she turned to Michael and whispered, "What does that mean?" he only shook his head, not wanting to scare her but unable to answer honestly, and Anna pressed her hands together tightly in her lap, trying to steady the trembling that she could not control, and she listened as the pilot spoke again, this time not to the passengers but into his radio, his words urgent, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Cessna 421, engine failure, requesting emergency landing," and for a moment Anna thought relief might be coming because surely someone on the ground would hear, surely they would help, but the radio crackled with static, the words breaking into pieces, some clear, some fading, and then nothing but hissing sound filled the cabin. And Anna's stomach dropped lower than the plane itself, because she understood that the one lifeline they needed was breaking, the pilot's calls not reaching anyone, and the sight of him through the slightly open cockpit door showed his hand moving quickly across switches and levers, his eyes focused but tense, and in that instant Anna felt something stir inside her, something unfamiliar but strong, like a tiny flame of responsibility, because she saw not just a man trying to save a plane, but a man trying to do it all alone, without another pilot, without help, and she thought about how every story she had heard about flying always mentioned two pilots, but here there was only one, and though she was just a child, she could see the truth, he needed someone beside him, someone to give him strength, even if that someone was her, yet her seat belt held her down and Michael's hand kept gripping her wrist, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking, and he whispered harshly, "Stay here. Anna, don't move," but she looked at him, her eyes steady even though her voice shook when she whispered back, "If he can't call for help, Somebody has to do something, and Michael's grip tightened because he wanted to protect her, wanted to keep her safe in row 8 where she belonged, but deep down he saw in her expression a bravery he had never noticed before, and though his fear told him to hold her back, his love for her made him let go, his hand sliding slowly off her wrist, and Anna, with her heart beating faster than it ever had, unbuckled her seat belt and stood up in the aisle, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath as the passengers turned their eyes toward the small girl moving slowly toward the front, her steps shaky but determined, and nobody said a word to stop her, maybe because they were too afraid themselves, maybe because they sensed in her a strange calmness that they could not explain, and as Anna walked past the rows she could hear whispers behind her, the quiet sobs of the woman with the bag, the whispered "God help us" from the elderly man, but she kept moving until she reached the cockpit, where the door stood open wide enough for her to see the pilot, his forehead glistening with sweat as he twisted knobs and pulled levers, his voice muttering to himself, come on," and without thinking Anna spoke, her voice soft but clear, "Sir," and the pilot turned, startled to see her standing there, a child with eyes full of both fear and courage, and he said quickly, "You need to go back to your seat, young lady," but Anna pointed to the microphone hanging loose, the one he had been using moments ago, and she said with surprising certainty, "It's not working right, is it? I can help. I can hold it steady. Just tell me what to do," and for a second John Kennedy, the man who had flown warplanes and faced storms stronger than this, stared at her in disbelief, because what kind of sense did it make to accept help from a 12-year-old, yet at the same time the plane jolted sharply, a reminder that time was not on his side, and he saw in her eyes not only fear but determination, and maybe it was desperation or maybe it was fate, but he nodded once and said firmly, "All right, sit here, but listen to me, don't let go until I tell you," and Anna slid into the co-pilot's seat, her small hands gripping the microphone as though it was the most important thing in the world, and for the first time since the engine had gone silent, she felt like she wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was part of something bigger, part of the fight to save everyone on board, and Michael, watching from row 8, leaned forward with his heart pounding, unable to believe what he was seeing, his little sister sitting at the front of the plane like she belonged there, and though fear filled his chest, pride swelled alongside it, because he realized that Anna, the girl he had always teased for dreaming too big, was about to prove that even the smallest voice could matter when the sky went quiet. Anna sat in the co-pilot's seat with her small hands clutching the microphone as tightly as if letting go would send the entire plane tumbling from the sky, and though her heart pounded wildly inside her chest, she forced herself to keep her eyes steady on the man beside her, John Kennedy, who moved his hands across switches and controls with practiced speed, his face lined with concentration and determination, and he said in a calm but commanding voice, "Repeat what I say, exactly how I say it." And Anna nodded quickly, her throat dry but her voice clear as she echoed his words, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Cessna 421, engine failure, requesting immediate assistance," and the microphone crackled with static at first, a hiss that made her want to pull it away from her mouth, but she held firm, her small voice carrying through the airwaves, and then to her relief another voice answered back, firm and calm, "Cessna 421, we read you, please state your altitude and heading," and Anna turned to John, her eyes wide, waiting for his instruction, and he told her quietly, 3,000 feet, heading southwest, and she repeated it into the microphone, her young voice carrying the message that might mean the difference between life and death. And for the first time since the silence of the engine had begun, a fragile thread of hope wound its way into the cabin, because the passengers could hear the exchange, could feel the connection to the world below, and whispers of relief moved down the rows like a wave, and Michael leaned forward in his seat, his hands clasped together, whispering under his breath as though each word his sister spoke might keep the plane afloat, and Anna, though still trembling, felt a new strength rising inside her, because even though she was just 12, even though her knees knocked together from fear, she knew her words were keeping them from being alone in the endless sky, and the voice from the tower guided them. Cessna 421, prepare for emergency landing, runway in sight, maintain heading, and John focused on keeping the aircraft level while instructing Anna to continue speaking, telling her exactly what to say, and she repeated it all, her voice steadying more with each sentence, and the people behind them began to see her not as a child but as something more, a thread of courage they could hold onto. And as the plane dipped lower through the clouds, Anna glanced outside and saw the ground rising to meet them, the patchwork of fields becoming sharper, roads stretching like gray ribbons, tiny houses scattered like toys, and for a moment her breath caught in her throat because the ground was coming closer too quickly, but John's voice kept her anchored, telling her when to speak and when to pause, and she obeyed every instruction with a seriousness that felt far older than her years, and in row 8 Michael's heart swelled with conflicting emotions, fear for his sister, awe at her bravery, and a fierce pride that made his eyes sting, because the girl he had always thought of as his little shadow was now carrying the voices of everyone on board, their hope riding on every word she spoke, and as the Cessna continued its descent, shaking slightly from turbulence, Anna gripped the microphone tighter and whispered to herself, I can do this, even though her hands were trembling, and John glanced at her briefly, giving her the smallest nod, as though to say he believed in her, and that simple gesture gave her the courage to keep going, and when the control tower voice came again, instructing them to brace for landing, Anna repeated the words loudly into the microphone, brace for landing, and though she was only 12, her voice carried authority that made the passengers obey immediately, bending forward, gripping the seats in front of them, preparing for the unknown that waited on the runway, and in that tense moment Anna understood something she had never thought about before. That courage was not about being fearless but about moving forward even when fear was everywhere, and she realized that she was not just helping the pilot, she was helping everyone, giving them something to hold onto when the world seemed to be slipping away, and outside the window the runway stretched out like a lifeline through the open fields, its long strip of asphalt gleaming under the sunlight, and Anna's breath caught again as the plane tilted, lowering toward it, the sound of rushing wind filling her ears, and John's voice grew sharper as he adjusted the controls, his hands moving quickly, his focus unbroken, but through it all he kept speaking to Anna, guiding her words into the microphone so that the tower knew exactly where they were, exactly what they were facing, and as the wheels drew closer to the ground, Anna closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a silent hope that everything would hold together, that somehow they would make it, and when she opened them again she saw Michael's face through the aisle, his eyes locked on hers, and in that look she found the strength to keep her grip steady, to keep her voice calm, to be more than just a kid in row 8, because now she was the voice of the plane, the bridge between the sky and the ground, and with every second that passed, the reality of what she was doing settled deeper into her heart, shaping her in ways she would never forget. The runway stretched ahead like a thin dark ribbon cutting through the open fields, and inside the small Cessna the silence of the passengers was broken only by the rushing sound of wind outside and the occasional shudder that ran through the body of the aircraft as it descended lower and lower, and Anna, still seated beside the pilot with the microphone clutched tightly in her hands, felt her heart beating so loudly that she wondered if the people in the back could hear it, yet her voice when she spoke into the radio was calm because she had learned in these few minutes that her words mattered more than her fear, and the control tower voice guided them again, Cessna 421, you are clear for emergency landing, maintain heading, fire and rescue standing by, and she repeated it just as John Kennedy had told her to, her young voice carrying steady across the cabin and bringing a new strength to the weary hearts of those listening, and Michael, still in row 8, watched with his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles ached, his eyes never leaving his sister as if by sheer will he could keep her safe, and the businessman who had been muttering prayers earlier now bowed his head completely, whispering them more softly, while the elderly couple clung to each other with trembling hands, and in the middle of it all Anna realized that she was not just speaking words anymore, she was carrying hope from the tower to the pilot, from the pilot to the passengers, a bridge between fear and survival, and John, though his face remained tight with concentration, allowed himself one quick glance at her and said quietly, "Good job, keep going," and those simple words gave Anna the strength to breathe again, to steady her shaking hands, and outside the window the ground was rising faster now, the fields growing larger, the houses no longer looking like toys but real homes with real people inside them, and the roadways stretching out like veins across the land, and Anna knew that soon, very soon, they would either be safe or they would not, and she whispered to herself, "Hold on, please hold on," though she did not know if she meant the plane, the pilot, or her own courage, and the descent grew sharper, the wheels nearing the runway, and John spoke quickly, "Brace, everyone brace," and Anna repeated it into the microphone with as much strength as her small voice could muster, and behind them the passengers obeyed, bending forward into their seats, clutching what they could, eyes closed and breaths held, and Michael leaned over with his arms wrapped around himself, yet his eyes never left Anna, as if watching her gave him courage too, and the plane roared with the sound of rushing air as it made its final approach, the nose tilted slightly, the wings trembling under the strain of the air currents, and then the ground met them with a violent jolt, the wheels slamming hard against the asphalt, bouncing once, twice, and Anna's stomach flew into her throat. As the cabin filled with screams and gasps, but John held the yoke firmly, fighting to keep the plane straight, his arms steady even as the Cessna rattled and shook like it might tear itself apart, and Anna clutched the microphone so tightly her fingers hurt, repeating John's last words into it though she wasn't even sure anyone could hear them anymore, and the plane screeched along the runway, sparks flying from one wheel as it struggled to hold, the sound of rubber burning filling the air. Until finally, after what felt like forever, the plane slowed, skidding and jerking but staying upright, the long strip of runway stretching behind them like a battle they had somehow survived, and when at last the plane came to a shuddering stop, silence filled the cabin, a silence that lasted only a second before it broke into sobs, gasps, and cries of relief, passengers holding each other, some covering their faces with their hands, some whispering words of thanks they had never thought to say aloud before, and Anna sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat, her chest heaving, the microphone still clutched in her hand as though it had become part of her, and John slowly leaned back, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes turning to her with gratitude that words could not capture, and he said softly, "You did it, Anna, you helped save us," and though his voice was calm, his words trembled with the weight of what had just happened, and Anna looked back toward row 8 where Michael had already unbuckled and was rushing forward, his face pale but his eyes full of tears, and when he reached her he pulled her into his arms so tightly that she could hardly breathe, whispering into her hair, "You saved me, you saved all of us," and Anna closed her eyes, letting the truth of those words sink in though she still felt like the same scared girl who had only wanted to help, and outside the plane red and yellow lights flashed across the runway as fire trucks and rescue vehicles rushed to their side, their tires screeching as they surrounded the aircraft, men in uniforms moving quickly, ready to help, but inside the plane there was a strange stillness, as though the passengers were too overwhelmed to move just yet, their minds still catching up to the miracle that had just taken place, and Anna, looking out at the flashing lights, thought to herself that she had never truly understood what it meant to be brave until this very moment, and even though she knew she was just a kid, just a girl in row 8, she also knew that courage did not wait for someone to be older, taller, or stronger. It came when it was needed, and when the tower's voice came faintly through the radio once more, Cessna 421, you are safe, well done. Anna's hand finally loosened on the microphone, the weight of it slipping gently away as she leaned into her brother's arms, her eyes filling with tears not of fear but of relief, and the passengers behind them began to clap softly at first, then louder, their hands coming together not just for the pilot who had landed the plane but for the little girl who had carried their voices when no one else could, and though Anna blushed at the sound, burying her face in Michael's shoulder, inside her heart she felt something she would carry forever, the knowledge that even the smallest voice can hold the power to steady the sky when everything feels like it is falling apart. The sound of the clapping inside the cabin still echoed softly when the rescue workers reached the aircraft, their footsteps hurried and their voices calm but urgent as they opened the doors and stepped inside to guide the passengers out, and for the first time since the long terrifying minutes in the air, the people on board felt the solid ground beneath them not just through the wheels of the plane but through the hands reaching in to help them walk toward safety, and Anna, still holding onto her brother, looked around at the faces of the passengers who had once been strangers but were now tied together by an unforgettable memory, their eyes filled with gratitude not only for the pilot who had landed the plane but for the girl who had spoken when silence would have meant despair, and John, still seated in the cockpit, gave a long breath of relief as he unfastened his belt and leaned back, his hands finally shaking after holding steady for so long, his face pale with exhaustion yet softened by the knowledge that they had made it, and as he turned toward Anna he gave her one last nod that needed no words because it carried the silent message of respect, admiration, and gratitude, and when Anna and Michael finally stepped out of the small plane into the cool evening air, they felt the strange quiet of the runway broken only by the flashing lights and the distant sound of sirens, and though rescue crews surrounded them, checking each passenger, asking if they were hurt, many of them pointed toward Anna, telling the rescuers, "That girl helped us, she saved us," and Anna, shy and overwhelmed, tried to hide behind Michael, but the looks in their eyes showed her that no matter how small she felt, she had done something large that day, and the businessman who had prayed during the flight came up to her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, saying with a trembling smile, "You reminded me to hope when I had none," and the elderly couple, still holding each other's hands, whispered softly, "You will never know how much courage you gave us," and Michael looked at his sister as though he were seeing her for the first time, not just as the younger sibling he had always tried to protect but as someone stronger than he could have ever imagined, and in that moment he realized that bravery was not about age or size but about heart, and Anna, though she could not find words to reply, simply smiled with tears shining in her eyes, and together they walked toward the waiting buses that would take them to the terminal where their families were waiting, the night air cool against their faces, the stars above steady and calm as though the sky itself was relieved, and as they sat down on the bus, the hum of the engine gentle compared to the roar they had just escaped, Anna leaned against Michael's shoulder, her small body tired from the weight of what she had carried, and he whispered quietly, "You're my hero," words that made her close her eyes with a soft smile, knowing she did not need anything else in that moment, and when the bus reached the terminal, the doors opened to a crowd of people waiting anxiously, families rushing forward, tears flowing freely, arms wrapping around loved ones, voices overlapping with joy and relief, and Anna and Michael stepped out together, greeted by their parents who ran toward them with open arms, their mother falling to her knees as she embraced them, her sobs full of love and fear turned into gratitude, their father holding them both tightly as if he would never let go again, and though they tried to ask what had happened, how it had happened, they only knew that their children had come back safe, and that was enough. And in the background reporters began to gather, cameras flashing, voices calling out questions, but Anna kept close to her brother and her parents, not ready to face the world outside their family, because what mattered most to her was that they were together again. And later, when the story spread, when newspapers wrote about the young girl who steadied the sky and the news channels showed her face alongside the flashing lights of the runway, Anna did not think of herself as a hero. She only thought of the moment she had held the microphone and spoken words she did not know she had inside her, and she realized that courage often appears in the most unexpected places, hidden until the very moment it is needed. And John, the pilot, visited them at the terminal before he was taken to rest, and he knelt down to Anna's height, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, saying, "You were my co-pilot today, and I will never forget that," and she smiled back, feeling her heart swell with pride and relief. And as days passed, the memory of that flight became a story told again and again, not only among the passengers who lived it but among strangers who heard it, people inspired by the bravery of a young girl who had reminded everyone that even the smallest voice can carry great strength. And Michael, whenever he thought of it, always remembered the way his sister had sat up front, her hands shaking yet her voice steady, and he promised himself that he would never underestimate her again. And Anna, though she returned to her normal life, going back to school, laughing with friends, and being the same cheerful girl she had always been, carried inside her a quiet strength that had been born that day, a strength that told her she could face fears, not because she was unafraid, but because she knew now that fear and courage could live side by side. And when at night she looked at the stars, she thought of the moment when the ground rose to meet the plane and the world seemed to hold its breath, and she remembered how it felt to speak words that mattered, words that gave hope. And though she never asked to be called a hero, she knew deep inside that sometimes life gives you one moment to rise, and if you take it, it will live with you forever. And so, the story of the flight did not end on the runway but in the hearts of those who had been there, and in the life of a girl who had discovered the true meaning of bravery in the sky.